The community that the product is able to create is arguably the most important source of value that product can ever have, whether we're talking about money, influence, recognition, or the level of success that product eventually reaches. So much of it comes down to the community behind it. And nowhere is that idea more true than in gacha games. I mean, over the years, we have watched gacha games rise to the very top of the industry, largely because of the loyalty, the passion, the support of their communities. And at the same time, we've also seen EOS after EOS from games that had plenty of potential, but never managed to build a community willing to stand behind them when things got difficult. But with that being said though, when it comes to gacha community specifically, there is one word that always seems to find its way into the conversation: toxicity. And according to a lot of content creators and a lot of discussions within the gacha space, there is one community that gets brought up more than any other when this topic comes up. A community that many people have labeled the most toxic in the entire genre: the Wuthering Waves community. So the question we're going to answer in this video is very simple. How true is this statement? Is it really that straightforward? Is this actually a black and white situation where you can point to a single community and confidently declare that they are the worst? Or is there a lot more nuance to this conversation than people are willing to admit? That's what we're going to talk about in this video. So if you're into the kind of content, make sure to like this video and let me know your thoughts. Whether you're a part of the Wuthering Waves community or you're coming from another community entirely, what do you think of the claim that the Wuthering Waves community is definitively the worst? Do you agree with it? Do you disagree? Do you think the reality is a lot more complicated than that? Tell me that and more in the comments below, and of course don't forget to subscribe if you can on any of my future videos. Alright, let's get into it. See, the idea of the Wuthering Waves community inherently being the worst community in the entire gacha space is a very interesting one, mostly because this is not some niche opinion held by a handful of people. No, this is a sentiment that you can find across a surprising number of different sections of the gacha community. In fact, in case you're not aware, a gacha content creator by the name of Arikado Zodan made a very interesting video recently discussing the current state of the gacha space. And during that video, he spoke about his personal perception of the Wuthering Waves community and how he views it today. And this is what he had to say.
There is, however, one critical variable that is the very reason why the tribalism has gotten so bad within the Western gacha community specifically. And while it resides primarily within the Wuthering Waves community, it is not actually the fault of the WUWA community at large, but rather a set of circumstances that position them in that situation. I'm referring to anti-Hoyoverse content creators, recognizable individuals, both big and small in size and reach, that for one reason or another has championed Wuthering Waves and Kuro Games as the ideal future for gacha games and gacha development. They then aggressively push the idea that WUWA is the only game worth recognizing within the space and regularly target Hoyoverse communities and Hoyoverse games, fighting back against tribalism with their own tribalism. This is why I believe the Wuthering Waves community is constantly referred to as the worst and is at odds with multiple different gacha communities all the time, Hoyoverse related or not. As I said earlier, there are deranged members found in every group in places like Twitter and Reddit, but if you stop to take a look at the content creation side, the difference is almost one-sided. It is proven to be a viable path in content creation to shape a channel solely around farming hate on anything that stands in opposition against Wuthering Waves, regardless of the approach taken and how direct the creator is with their response. And if there's no content to be made at any moment to bash an opposing game, there is always the option to churn out as much fluffed up praise content as they wish to then feed into the community elitism and toxic positivity. You will not find this many public faces of a community behaving this way on behalf of Genshin Impact. You will not find this many for Honkai Star Rail. You will not find this many for Zenless Zone Zero, Arknight's Enfield, Neverness to Everness, the list goes on and on. The decentralized hub of Twitter and Reddit and its users are not held to the same standards of public decorum and respect the same way a content creator is. And it's because this behavior is accepted, and in some cases rewarded, within the Wuthering Wave space is why there is so much friction between WUWA and everybody else. Because of this, it's incredibly hard to talk about the Wuthering Waves community free from addressing its anti-Hoyoverse side, as WUWA's community has its share of issues with elitism and toxic positivity. But it's impossible to say how much of it is of their own genuine beliefs, and how much of it is fueled by the need to look superior over Genshin Impact or any other competing game. As for Genshin Impact's community, it shouldn't.
Now, regardless of how you feel about what Arikado said, whether you agree with him completely or disagree with him entirely, as I always say whenever I make a video discussing the opinions of another content creator, the goal here is not to create conflicts with Arikado or be negative towards him in any way. If for nothing else, because as said earlier, this is not the sentiments that Arikado created. I mean, whether you're talking about the general perception of the Wuthering Waves community or the behavior of some of his content creators, these are opinions that have been repeated, discussed, and reinforced by a portion of the gacha community for a long long time. But as with every argument, every criticism, there is always another side to the discussion, a nuance that starts to appear once you look at the situation from a different angle. And diving into that nuance is where this conversation starts to get a whole lot more interesting. So if we're going to properly analyze what is going on here, I think there are three major areas we need to look at. The first is the community itself. And by that, I mean the places where the average player actually interacts with the game and with other players. Reddit, Twitter, these platforms where people gather to talk about Wuthering Waves. We're going to look directly at the conversations taking place within this community and examine how this alleged toxicity is actually expressed. But more importantly, we're going to ask a much bigger question. What else do we see when we look at the community? I mean, is toxicity truly the defining characteristic of the Wuthering Waves player base? Or in the very least, is it the dormant streak that outshadows everything else? Or are there other qualities, behaviors, contributions that tend to get ignored whenever this discussion gets brought up? After that, we're going to move into the game itself, more specifically, the community's involvement in shaping it. I mean, like I said at the beginning of this video, the reason this community exists at all is because of the game. Wuthering Waves is the product that brought these people together in the first place. And if we've already established that communities can have enormous influence over the products they support, then the obvious question becomes, how much impact has the Wuthering Waves community actually had on the evolution of the game? Has the community helped improve the game? Has it made certain aspects worse? These are questions we're going to answer in this section. And then finally, we're going to talk about content creators. I mean, if you spent any amount of time in the gacha space, you've probably heard plenty of opinions about the Wuthering Waves content creators. Some positive, some negative, some extremely negative. I mean, there are a lot of claims made about this side of the community. But at the same time though, there are also certain things you would notice about the Wuthering Waves creators and the role they play in the broader gacha discussions. So in this final discussion, we'll be looking at both sides of the conversation and trying to answer one very simple question. Is it just a situation that the content creators are simply bad, or is there more to that conversation? So let's start with the first thing, the Wuthering Waves community itself. And right out the bat, I think it is important to establish something before we go any deeper into this discussion. The idea that when you're analyzing a community, you have to separate genuine discussions from what is essentially an emotional cesspool. I mean, every community has its worst sides, its loudest, most unreasonable voices. And if we're being fair, one of the biggest examples of that within the Wuthering Waves community is the endless Wuthering Waves versus Genshin Impact arguments. Now, do not get me wrong. I can appreciate a classic WoW versus Genshin debate as much as anybody else. The problem is that calling most of these interactions debates is honestly a massive overstatement. I mean, if we're being honest, what they usually amount to is two groups of people throwing insults at each other while accomplishing absolutely nothing. Very little of it resembles actual discussions, and even less represents the average player from either community. That being said though, acknowledging that doesn't mean there hasn't been genuine toxicity associated with the Wuthering Waves community. In fact, one example that immediately comes to mind is the situation involving Wuthering Waves and Neverness to Everness. See, for those who don't know, not too long ago, there was a situation where someone intentionally manipulated footage from Neverness to Everness, specifically the Scarlet Letter introductory scene, to make it look extremely similar to the Fractidus reveal scene from the Wuthering Waves 2.7 story. Now, if you actually took the time to watch both scenes from start to finish and looked at the full context, the conclusion most people would probably come to is that this wasn't some blatant copy. At most, you could argue that there was inspiration taken from Wuthering Waves. But instead of researching the situation, instead of looking into the full context, a portion of the community immediately decided that the better option was to clown on Neverness to Everness and point at it as a game that is supposedly stealing from Wuthering Waves. Now, we can argue that the developers of Neverness to Everness, Hotel Studios, is notorious from copying from other gacha games. But the reality is that this scene in particular, this situation was not one of those moments, and it would have done the Wuthering Waves community a lot of good to understand that. That being said though, the big question we have to ask ourselves is this: are situations like these what actually define the Wuthering Waves community? Is it really a situation where every single time you open social media, all you see is this community clowning on every other gacha game while blindly hyping up Wuthering Waves? Well, obviously not. In fact, I would argue that contrary to popular belief, with the exception of Hoyoverse games, particularly Genshin Impact for reasons we'll go into later, you generally do not see interaction between Wuthering Waves and any other gacha game that are any more toxic than what is generally considered normal within the genre. And yes, I know we just spoke about NCE, but I would argue that situations like that are more of an exception than the norm. And even within that particular case, it is important to remember that the community was being shown an out of context clip. And as a result, they did the same thing that most other communities probably would have done: react based on the information that was put in front of them. And to be fair, that information was incredibly convincing, but what you tend to notice is that the Wuthering Waves community often find itself playing defense, constantly trying to correct or disprove allegations directed at the game. And a very good example of this was the Monye AI situation that happened months ago, around the time the Lahai Red characters were first being introduced to the community. I mean, instead of celebrating and hyping up the reveal of these absolutely phenomenal characters, talking about their designs, getting excited about what they could bring to the story, a large portion of the conversation ended up revolving around pushing back against accusations that we all ended up finding out were either misleading or outright false. And even going beyond defense and into the realm of positivity, one of the biggest positives for the Wuthering Waves community becomes apparent when we look at a group of people who have historically received some of the worst treatment in the entire gacha space: voice actors. I mean, if there's one thing that gacha communities have consistently proven over the years, it is that voice actors often end up getting the shortest end of the stick. I mean, we've seen voice actors get harassed because the characters that they voiced did not play well. We've seen them get attacked for liking a post. We've seen people get upset because a voice actor reacted to something they did not agree with. And heaven forbid a voice actor openly supports a shape that a part of the community does not like. And what we've come to realize is that situations like these have led to voice actors completely cutting themselves off from fan communities. In some cases, they've stopped interacting altogether. In others, they never even attempted to build a relationship with the community in the first place because the risk simply wasn't worth it. But when it comes to the relationship between the voice actors and the Wuthering Waves community, something very different has happened. I mean, the community has shown a level of maturity and acceptance that, quite frankly, is not something you consistently see across the wider gacha space. In fact, I would go as far as to say that one of the groups that benefits the most from interaction with the Wuthering Waves community is the voice actors themselves. I mean, take Amanda Rachel, for example, the voice of Quarterthea and Fleur-de-Lis. Someone who at this point is practically a full-fledged content creator within the community. Then you have Alexandra Gelf, the voice of Cantarella, who openly admitted that it was the overwhelmingly positive reception towards Cantarella that encouraged her to become more active online.
I love Cantarella so much. She's the whole, the Wuthering Waves community is the whole reason why I show my face on the internet. Do you know what I mean? I never used to do this, but everybody was so incredibly kind and welcoming when that character came out that I kind of was like, oh, well.
And today she has also stepped into the content creation space. You also have Huey O'Grady, the voice of Brant and Christopher, who during the call with Amanda mentioned that he plans on streaming Wuthering Waves in the near future. I mean, these are only a few examples. But what makes all of this noteworthy is that these voice actors don't just tolerate interacting with the community, they seem to genuinely enjoy it. I mean, thanks to the acceptance they received from the Wuthering Waves community, many of them have found it's not only safe to step in front of a camera, but genuinely comfortable to do so. We even have situations where the community actively defends voice actors from what many consider needless and unfair criticism. A good example of this was the Ashes to Ashes situation involving Jodie Bell Cortez, the voice actor for Denia. A situation where, despite the intense criticism coming from outside sections of the community, a large portion of the Wuthering Waves player base stood in defense of her performance. And what is really interesting is how that situation ended. I mean, after all the criticism, Denia ultimately went on to have what I would consider some of the best voice work in the entire game. Now, moving on to the impact of the Wuthering Waves community on Wuthering Waves itself, and this is where the conversation really starts to get interesting. Because there is one term that has somehow become attached to the Wuthering Waves community that for the life of me, I simply cannot understand. That term is toxic positivity. A term that by definition is the belief that people should maintain a positive attitude regardless of how bad a situation becomes. So in the context of gaming, it would mean defending a game no matter what it does, refusing to acknowledge its flaws and accepting every decision without criticism. And quite frankly, that description could not be further from the truth when it comes to the Wuthering Waves community. As a matter of fact, I believe this is a narrative that has largely been pushed by the pro-Hoyo side of the gacha community and by certain content creators within despair as a way to diminish the Wuthering Waves player base. And I believe that's for two major reasons. The first is the simple reality that Wuthering Waves has experienced enormous growth as a game. Growth that has been definitively accompanied by constant feedback from its communities. I mean, think about it for a moment. One of the most commonly repeated phrases associated with Wuthering Waves is devs listen. People say it constantly. But if the community truly operated on toxic positivity, if players accepted every decision Crew Games made regardless of quality, if every update was blindly praised no matter how good or bad it was, then what exactly were the developers listening to? I mean, the implication would be that every time the developers thanked players for their feedback, they were essentially thanking them for something that did not exist, or in the very least they were thanking players for the bare minimum feedback. And even if someone wanted to argue that argument immediately falls apart when you look at the game's actual history. I mean, take versions 2.8 and 3.0 for example, patches that we understand received enormous amounts of criticism, particularly regarding the direction of the story. I mean, videos were made, discussions exploded across social media, with players openly voicing their dissatisfaction with aspects of the narrative and where they thought the game was heading. I mean, it's become so bad that Chisa right now is considered an NPC within Wuthering Waves by Wuthering Waves players. And it's funny because it's true. Or look at version 2.7, a version that's heavily divided the community due to the fact that at that period, many players felt that outside of the story itself, there simply wasn't enough content to keep them engaged. And if we even want a more recent example, we can look at the collaboration gacha system. I mean, once again, the community found itself split right down in the middle because of changes that many players felt made the system noticeably worse than the Wuthering Waves standard gacha model.
We're not dumb. We all know what's going on here, man. And so getting back over to this is garbage, fundamentally so. You probably also shouldn't converted your pulls over. It sucks, man.
And this was already concerning for free-to-play players, many of whom already struggled to maximize their pulls under normal circumstances. And what happened? People complained, people criticized. There were endless debates, exactly what you would expect from a community that is willing to challenge decisions it disagrees with. And these are not isolated incidents either. I mean, they are part of a larger pattern that we've seen repeated throughout the game's lifespan. And many of these criticisms have come from people who genuinely love the game. So really, this brings us to the obvious question. If the community has repeatedly demonstrated a willingness to criticize Wuthering Waves whenever it feels something is wrong, then where exactly did this idea of toxic positivity even come from? And well, with the exception of certain people within the pro-Hoyo crowd pushing that narrative, I think a large part of where this idea came from is a simple misunderstanding. I mean, people look at the Wuthering Waves community's attitude towards Wuthering Waves and confuse warranted praise for toxic positivity. I mean, let's be fair, Wuthering Waves is a gacha game, and just like every other gacha game, it comes with a lot of systems and design choices that players need to accept before they even start playing. The gacha system and the like, I mean, these are things that people have complained about endlessly, but also these are things that are associated with the gacha genre. But talking about Wuthering Waves as a video game in particular, what you would come to realize is that Wuthering Waves simply does not mess up very often. And I know that is a statement some people are going to disagree with, but when you actually look at the game's history, patch after patch, story after story, character after character, it becomes surprisingly difficult to find major issues that haven't already been criticized or eventually addressed. In fact, I would challenge anyone watching this video to tell me in the comments. I mean, we've already established that version 3.0 received criticism because of its story. We've already established that version 3.4 received criticism because of its collaboration gacha system. But throughout the entire Lahaira experience, what else has there been to criticize that hasn't either already been criticized or already been fixed? Is it the storage space, the same storage issue that the developers have spent multiple versions optimizing and improving? Or is it character integration within the stories? A problem that existed within parts of the Renesita storyline but is largely absent throughout the Lahaira narrative. I mean, again and again, what we've seen from Wuthering Waves is a game that consistently tries to improve itself. Whether it's with performance optimizations, quality of life improvements, old issues being addressed. And every now and then, we even get features that literally nobody was asking for but end up being incredibly fun additions anyway. The flying bag probably being the best examples of that. So when people see the community praising the game, I think many of them immediately jump to the conclusion that it must be toxic positivity. But the reality is, rather than toxic positivity, what if the praise is simply earned? What if the reason people are positive is because they genuinely like the direction the game is heading? I mean, at the end of the day, if criticism is acceptable when a game does something wrong, then praise should be equally acceptable when a game does something right. And from Wuthering Waves' track record, this game has consistently done more right than wrong, especially in the eyes of the community. So if we're willing to criticize Wuthering Waves when it disappoints us, then we should also be willing to give it credit when it succeeds. And from what I've seen, that is exactly what this community does. Now we move on to the content creator side of the discussion. And listen, if there is one thing I can agree with Ricardo Zodan on, it is the reality that a lot of Wuthering Waves content creators, myself included, heavily integrate Genshin Impact criticism and Hoyoverse criticism in general into our content. I mean, that is simply true. Video after video, analysis after analysis, we spend a lot of time dissecting and, more often than not, criticizing decisions made within Hoyoverse games. And in my case, that primarily means Genshin Impact. But this brings me to a very important question that I want everyone watching this video to genuinely think about. I mean, while I can only speak for myself, I would imagine many other creators would appreciate this question being asked as well. So here it is. Am I wrong? Or to put it more plainly, am I unfair in my criticism of Genshin Impact? When you actually get into the content itself, am I slandering Genshin Impact? Am I lying or spreading baseless rumors? Am I inventing problems that don't exist? I mean, take for example, this video I made criticizing the poll count of version 6.6 and calling it disappointing. Was the content of that video a lie? Were the criticisms fabricated? Or how about this video discussing how underwhelming certain highly anticipated characters turned out to be? Characters that, based on the lore and expectations built around them, failed to live up to what many players imagined they would become. I mean, you can like those characters, hell, you can even disagree with my conclusion. But is it really unreasonable to have those thoughts when looking at what was actually presented in the game? And these are important questions because whenever the topic of Genshin Impact criticism becomes associated with Wuthering Waves creators, the discussion is often framed in a very specific way. I mean, the creators become the villains, the criticism itself becomes the problem. The implication being that if these creators are willing to criticize Hoyoverse games, then surely they must be willing to attack every other gacha game as well, but that is simply not true. And honestly, it is a pretty dishonest narrative. Looking at my own content, for instance, yes, I have made a couple of videos about Neviness to Everness and Arknight Enfield, but what you notice is that my NTE content, rather than being centered around criticizing the game or tearing it down, is more focused on trying to understand what is wrong with the game and discussing potential solutions to those problems. And when it comes to Arknight Enfield, most of my discussion has been positive, particularly regarding its gameplay experience, which I have called one of the best, if not the single best in the entirety of Gacha, with the only major criticism I have consistently consistently had being directed towards its gacha system, which I believe is completely deserved. Hell, even in the video that Ricardo used, where he listed out the content creators that are a part of the problem, you will notice something very quickly, that the overwhelming majority of the criticism is directed towards Hoyoverse games, and there is a reason for that. Because whether people like it or not, Hoyoverse games, particularly Genshin Impact, have become the standard that much of the gacha industry is measured against. These are the games that sit at the very top. But they are also, in many people's eyes, the game that often do the least with the advantages they possess. And yes, I can already hear someone saying, well, if you don't like it, don't play it. And honestly, I have never understood that argument. What if I do want to play it? What if I'm invested in the story? What if I've spent years following the world, the characters, the narrative? Why should the only acceptable options be either blindly accepting everything or walking away entirely? What happened to the third option? The option where you continue playing while voicing your frustration. Because regardless of how people feel about the so-called anti-Hoyo creators or the supposedly terrible Wuthering Waves creators, there is one thing that I have consistently said for months, and one thing that I still have yet to see disproven. The existence of Wuthering Waves, and by extension, the creators willing to openly criticize Hoyoverse, has had a noticeable impact in the broader gacha conversation. I mean, take creators like Doro44 and Brand Online. Creators who for a long time largely accepted whatever Genshin Impacts put in front of them. Yet over the last year or two, we have seen them become increasingly willing to speak out when they disagree with something. We've seen them voice frustrations that previously would have gone unspoken. And I do not believe that is a coincidence or some epiphany that they suddenly had. Because we've also seen this shift across a huge number of creators, including many who have absolutely nothing to do with Wuthering Waves. I mean, if you look at the last 2 years of Genshin Impact's lifespan, something becomes very apparent. We have seen more criticism, more pushback, more players and creators openly voicing dissatisfaction and willing to challenge decisions they disagree with. As I said earlier, we've seen more of that during the last 2 years than we saw during much of the first 4 years of the game's existence. And the same can even be said for Genshin Impact itself. I mean, don't get me wrong, the game still make decisions that leave people scratching their heads in disbelief. That has not changed. But it's also true that we've seen meaningful growth from Genshin Impact in recent years. And whether you attribute that growth to competition from Wuthering Waves, pressure from a more vocal player base, creators becoming less afraid to criticize the game, or some combination of all three, the outcome remains the same. Genshin Impact has grown. And I would argue that it has grown more over the last 2 years than at any point in its lifespan. And if criticism played even a small role in making that happen, then perhaps criticism was never the problem in the first place. See, when it's all said and done, you can have whatever feelings you have about the Wuthering Waves community, and even the Wuthering Waves content creators. It is ultimately your decision whether you want to interact with the community or not. But the idea of calling an entire community the most toxic simply because they do not do things the way you expect them to, or the idea of blaming content creators for expressing frustration instead of blaming the company for creating that frustration in the first place, all of that sounds a little disingenuous to me. Now, I understand that I am more on the Wuthering Waves side of this argument, so I will agree that there's probably a part of me, even if I don't realize it, that is naturally inclined to defend Wuthering Waves. So with that, I extend an open invitation to anyone who wants to react to this video. Perhaps I'm far more biased than I believe or intend to be, or maybe I'm not. That being said though, let me know what you think in the comments below, and as always, I'll catch you in the next one.